Use the Force, Luke.
Hi, everyone. Dr. Phil here today, and I'm going to give you some examples of basic games UX considerations. So, if you know a lot about games UX, this is going to be stuff you already know, but this is built to go in conjunction with the assignment where you talk about conceptions you have going into things. These are 10 really important things to keep in mind as you start to think about game UX. Okay, so the first thing you have to remember is you cannot design for everyone. And I say this in a number of classes. I say this in my design classes. I say this in my writing for games classes. But it's particularly important when you're thinking about a UX. People will commonly say they're trying to design something for everybody. The problem with that is if I ask you who everybody is and you try to make a list of the things that you would include in a description of everybody, it ends up that you're designing for no one at all because everyone could be anyone and people are so different that you just can't isolate it. So the first thing you have to do as you're starting to think about the UX of your game is you have to figure out who your core audience is and what your core audience will need. This is going to mean inevitably that you have to make design decisions that will not appeal to everyone. This is why if you look up just about any game on the internet, you'll find people who love it and people who hate it. The ones that do better with UX have far more people who love them than hate them. But you can't make something everyone's going to love. So your goal can't be to design for everyone. It needs to be to design for the audience that you want to design for in the best way possible. The next thing, this is a sad thing for me as a person who has a PhD in English, but people don't read. Those of you who have been longtime gamers may remember, or if you've bought vintage games, you may remember, video games used to come with manuals. And that ended in the late 90s, early 2000s, because no one read the manual. People would just jump into the game and start playing. People do not want to read. They don't want to read long quests. If any of you have played a game like World of Warcraft, people will walk up to the quest giver and punch the buttons as fast as they possibly can, and then look at the summary to figure out what they need to do. So you need to use text. That's the way we work. That's what I'm doing right now. I have text up here to guide you through what I'm doing, but you need to not use a great deal of text. People are not playing your game to read it. They're playing your game to have a gameplay experience. And if you put too much text in, people just will not read the text flat out. They won't read it. And you have to know that going in. People also aren't going to dig for information. There are some exceptions to this, which we'll get into in a second when I talk about genre expectations. But for the most part, if a person can't figure out how to do something in your game, they aren't going to dig and dig and dig to figure it out. It doesn't mean it can't be challenging. It just means there needs to be an apparent reason for you to look for the things that you're looking for. If you don't prompt people, they're not going to go through huge menu systems. That's just not the way people feel about things. If you look at reviews that have just come out of the newest Madden game, for example, one of the big complaints is that the menu system is archaic and old and difficult to manage. People don't want to dig several layers deep to find what they're after. People want the most immediate, intuitive response they can. The next thing you have to remember, though, is people have played other games. And that probably seems super obvious, but sometimes we forget. You don't want to put something on a button or on a menu where people don't expect it to be, because people are used to playing games. And as such, when you pick up a controller or if you sit down at a keyboard, there are certain expectations. If you make a game and WASD doesn't move around, you need to have a really, really good reason why you didn't do that. Because from a UX perspective, that is the experience that many players are going to expect. They're going to think, okay, this is what this button does. If I hit escape, a menu is going to pop up. These are things that almost always happen. If you have thumbsticks, for example, I have a Switch sitting here, this thumbstick should move me around inside of the game. If it doesn't, something weird's going on. So you need to know people have played games and they expect to see certain things. There can be times when you need to break these conventions in order to make your game interesting, but for the most part, you want to follow the things people have learned from other games before. Another thing that's really important to remember is colors and sounds mean specific things to certain audiences. For example, if there's going to be a fire spell, it should probably be red, maybe a bright yellow or orange. If there's going to be a water or ice spell, it should be blue. These are things that people expect. If you make your fire green, someone's going to have trouble parsing out why that's fire. So you need to know that. And of course, there's also the factor of people who are colorblind, which is a different thing, which goes into usability as well. But you need to think about what certain things mean. You need to think about what a ding means. If you have like a bell sound, you think about what the sound of shattering glass would mean, etc. Those things have certain connotations that people understand in certain ways. If the music becomes more intense, that usually means something. If the music becomes more playful, that means something. You don't want to counteract that without a very, very strong reason, because people have mental associations with these things and they will expect them as part of the user experience. The next thing is you have to remember people have different needs. There was a discussion in one of our classes about Animal Crossing. This is a good example of where this comes into play. The idea of Animal Crossing is for you to play slowly and to savor what you're doing and to just kind of be relaxed and laid back and not particularly worried about being a power user, for example. You're just, picking your fruit and talking to your islanders and terraforming and building your houses and visiting places. Some players can't stand that. Some people can't stand the numerous dialogues you have to go through to do certain things. That is not necessarily a bad UX, however. That is a clash in the needs of your players. And you could argue that to have a better UX, Animal Crossing should offer you the ability to play either way, to also move through things quickly. But the decision that was made from a UX perspective is that Animal Crossing is supposed to move slowly, ergo, nothing's going to go particularly fast just because you wish it would. This also applies to people who have specialized needs, and we'll talk much more about that in class. But you want to think sometimes about what are the players that depend on audio cues more than others? Who are the players who play with the sound off or who can't hear at all? What do you do if someone's colorblind? What do you do if someone has trouble with depth perception, etc.? These are all things you have to keep in mind as you're designing games. The next thing to remember, and this is super important, and I think I probably stressed this to death in the first lecture, so I'm not going to hang on this too long here. But remember, the goal of creating a good UX is not to make the game easy. There's a difference between being usable and intuitive and being not challenging or very easy to pull off. You don't want to make your game too easy in the name of UX because that will also kill your game. Games that are too easy to play aren't any fun. But you want to think about the difference between the word easy and the word intuitive. It should always make sense what you're about to do next in a game. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the game would be easy by any standard. Some games are still incredibly difficult and are considered to have some of the best UX that exists. Just bringing this one back, this is super important to remember. People do not read things. It's kind of sad, but it's true. And you need to remember this because one of the things that people will say frequently when they're designing a game is, well, that was in the directions, or you had a tooltip that told you that. You can't assume that people are going to read those things. So if there's text that your player absolutely has to see, there's something that the player needs to read no matter what. It needs to be a part of some kind of interactive moment in the game. It needs to actually pop up on the screen. They need to pick up something and be forced to read what's on it in order to move forward. If you don't do that, people are not going to read text. Those of you who have played the Dark Souls games, anything in the Souls series, there's a whole lore on tooltips that a number of players have no idea about because they have not read those. So remember, people do not read. They don't like to read. They're not going to read. They're not playing a game to read in most cases. So if they need text, you need to get it to them in a way that is effective. The next thing to remember is genres bring with them certain expectations. And then, again, I'm not going to harp on this because we'll talk about it a lot more during the semester. But if you're going to make a first person shooter, you need to know what first person shooters are like. If you're going to make a MOBA, you need to know what MOBAs are like. If you're going to make an RPG, you need to know what RPGs are like. Because people have played those games before. You're not making the first one. And so you can move away from some of the expectations, but you need to adhere to enough of them that people know that they've picked up something and they're playing it the way that they're playing it. The same is true of sports games, puzzle games, anything like that. You need to know what a genre does, and those expectations are part of the user experience. And then lastly, this is the thing to remember. The key here is fun. Now, the word fun is a little nebulous, so you have to be careful with it. But when I say fun here, you're thinking about enjoyment for your user. That could be enjoyment through challenge, enjoyment through reward, enjoyment through just the sheer joy of how the flow state of something feels. But the key to a good user experience is fun. If your game isn't fun on some level, if it's not enjoyable, it doesn't matter how usable it seems from the outside. If the experience isn't fun, people aren't going to want to play your game. And so there's 10 basics that'll just kind of prime you for the much deeper dive that we're going to take through the course of the semester. If you have questions about any of these comments, just let me know, and I will be back with you very soon. Thanks, everyone.
He'll doctor fill your mind with knowledge. He'll doctor fill your heart with pain.